I've asked Sam, the head gardener at Bishop's, just to give us an overview of composting and how it's used in Bishop's and how it's beneficial to both gardeners and to wildlife. So Sam, first of all, how is composting beneficial to the gardener?
Well, obviously each year we produce a lot of organic waste in the garden, so in a sense it's useful for us to recycle all that carbon and all those nutrients that we have growing in the garden, and then reuse them and put them back on the soil each year. And so what we're trying to do essentially is build up the humus levels in the soil. And what's so great about humus is that it holds minerals and nutrients in a way that makes them release very slowly into the soil solution, so plants can use them over a long period of time. And it does things like lock up carbon, which is obviously essential for plant growth, but also essential for sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere. So we're trying to build up the humus layer on the kind of top of our soil horizon, really, to make it as good an environment as possible for plants to grow in.
Excellent. So just so people are aware, because obviously humus can also be put on crackers, just tell us what do you mean by humus?
Humus, I think the scientific description of it is actually quite sketchy. They're not 100% sure exactly what it is, but it's there are structures that hold nutrients and minerals. They're quite porous structures, and they come from organic matter, essentially. And it's through a process of decomposition of the kind of green vegetation or brown vegetation by things like fungi, bacteria, other soil microbes and macrofauna. They create some really nice, porous, moisture retentive, nutrient holding stuff, which is known as humus. But basically that's what we're trying to create, essentially, our compost heaps.
Okay, so compost is clearly great for gardeners, but how do you go about making compost? I know people won't have one the size you've got here, because obviously you've got a huge garden to look after. But just describe us through, what's the cycle of making compost?
The cycle of making compost it can be as long or as short, really, as you want it to be. It depends what you're composting, what kind of thing you're trying to achieve. Our cycle is only about 2 to 3 years, and we can actually make a bay of compost within a year if we're really good at watering it and keeping on top of it, and actually turning it as well. So this is our compost that we've just started making this year. We've got lots of rakings out of the lawn that are going on here. There's quite a lot of woody material in here as well. Generally you're trying to create a mix of about 50-50 between this sort of green waste and woody material, because what you're trying to achieve is something where you've got lots of different nutrients from lots of different sources, and you've got lots of different microorganisms, so things like fungi, actinomycetes, bacteria, and obviously the macrofauna in there as well, that you can then put back onto the soil. And so, for example, very ligninified material, so something that's got a lot of wood in it, will attract more fungi, whereas very sort of soft green, easily decomposed material like this thatch that's come out of the lawn, that will attract more kind of bacteria and the macrofauna. So we're trying to get a mix of two, and it'll give us a nicer, more aerated compost in the long run. And so this is one of our compost bins that has been going for just over a year, probably something more like a year and a half, and it's already more or less broken down. We still get a few leaves and bits that don't really break down, just because of how we look after the bins, which is we don't tend to turn them. It's a lot of work, and as you can probably see, it's a lot darker. You can see it's broken down. It's very friable, loose, porous, moisture retentive. You can kind of push it together in your hand. You can probably almost squeeze water out of it, and it's beautiful stuff, really. Lots of organic matter to go back on our soil.
So Sam, this looks very different from the sort of grass cuttings that you showed us in the first compost mound. What's actually happening here?
We use this bin to put all of our leaves, which we compost separately, because leaves basically break down at a much slower rate than the rest of the compost. Otherwise, what we end up with is just big wadges of leaves in our compost. They are really high in tannins, generally, from broadleaf trees in this country, which means that some of the bacteria, it just takes a little longer to break them down, essentially. But we can use leaf mould for adding to compost that we use for potting. So we can actually use it as a substitute for some of the composts that we would otherwise buy in, which is fantastic because it means we're recycling more carbon within the garden and we're becoming more sustainable in that sense. We're not buying in stuff from outside. So it's really good stuff.
So Sam, that's a great introduction to your composts and how it's important for gardeners. How does it benefit wildlife?
The compost heaps benefit wildlife in a multitude of ways, really. Probably the main thing to remember is that the soil is an ecosystem in the same way that above ground has ecosystems. So there are millions, actually billions of microfauna and bacteria and fungi and whatever living in the soil. And other end of the scale, there are the kind of above ground macrofauna, so things like slow worms. We don't have grass snakes here, but hopefully at some point we'll have grass snakes here. So reptiles, amphibians will use the compost heaps to live in. They're a great overwintering sheltering site for hedgehogs and other small mammals, and obviously insects will also use them. Things like hoverflies and bumblebees will use them as nesting sites. So I mean, over the year and a half I've been here, I've seen wasps and hoverflies nesting in these heaps. So they're a great site for other animals.
So we've worked out now how your compost heaps are actually put together. What have you got in the bucket?
In this bucket we have got, or in this barrow I should say, we have got some fantastic homemade compost. This is only a year old actually, and it's a brilliant sort of nutrient rich, moisture holding compost. You can push it together, you should do that, it's good compost. And we've just been spreading it over our veg beds here in the veg garden. Each year we put quite a thick mulch of compost on our veg beds because otherwise it's really difficult to grow good quality veg and grow it organically. Basically, if you feed the soil is an engine which is creating growth of the plants. So feeding the soil is the most important thing, and then yeah, you feed it with this lovely stuff.
So Sam, clearly gardens are potentially a brilliant habitat for all sorts of creatures, in particular earthworms. And just so people know, there's not just one species of earthworm, there's actually 27 species of earthworm in the UK. How are earthworms actually a gardener's friend? How are they a benefit to the gardeners?
So you get earthworms that will move vertically, and you get earthworms that will move horizontally through the soil, usually within the top kind of horizons of the soil. And what they do is the benefit to gardeners is that they move organic matter, including nutrients that plants need to grow, from the top regions of the soil down, and that means that they can incorporate those nutrients into the soil and they can be used by the roots of plants for the plants to grow. You'll probably often see actually when it's wet, maybe in the autumn or in the spring, you'll see worm casts on your lawn, and they're incredibly fertile. They're full of nutrients, worm casts. So yeah, worms are fantastic. They also add porosity to the soil, so that gives it structure, and that allows those pores to fill with moisture and hold more moisture, so increase what's called the field holding capacity of the soil, which again will allow more nutrients to be available for plant roots. So all in all, they're fantastic little creatures.